Whoever said rabbis don't rock? That person was false. How you doing, my holy sisters and brothers? We've got a beautiful teaching. We're going to be finishing up the first Mishna of chapter 3 here on Daf Lamed, page 30 of tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this lovely, though somewhat cloudy here in LA, Tuesday evening? It's Tuesday, right? Here we go. James Roth says shalom from Indianapolis. Yehudit Sobel, shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Stephen Giger, shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Bill Eldridge from Arkansas. Nancy Brandemole, right from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Amy Kolesa from Maryland. Jonathan Hain from Twin Cities, Minnesota. Caroline Stagg, shalom from Oviedo, Florida. Gwen Strong from Michigan. Melissa Itel-Jurin from Great Neck, New York. Sandy McMurray says Michigan is here. Ed Berg with us from Galloway, New Jersey. John Shore from Sedona, Arizona. Pedro Fotografo, shalom from Orlando. Brandon Christian Sullivan, shalom from Knoxville, Tennessee. Edward Kramer, Colombian South America. Coffee country, beautiful. Welcome, Edward. Timothy Heath from New Bedford, Massachusetts. Pamela Buffington Eric from Austin. Hiya, Salanina. Hello, Pamela. Stephanie Marie Diaz says shalom aleichem. Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago. Sarah McKay says shalom from Apple Valley, California. Thank you for your teachings. In the times of isolation, they do light up the world. Thank you so much, Sarah. Alice Gross has returned from Baltimore. Elizabeth Hunt-Lucarini is with us from Tucson. Tim Alexander, shalom from the UK. Welcome, Tim. And Claire Congro from Georgia. Over on the YouTube side, Neil is with us from Virginia. Marasia from Atlanta, Georgia. And Vaughn Billow from Fremont, Ohio. Before I forget, we have a dedication today. Oh my goodness, where did it go? Where did it go? Give me 1 second. I should have had it ready, but it is here. Okay, Lily Artenstein is dedicating our learning today in our Class AT Daily to her mother and father, Rose K. de Picciotto, Umberto de Picciotto. May their memories always be for a blessing, Lily, and we're honored to honor their memory with our learning in this class. Okay, put that over there. All right, so we're finishing up our discussion of the first Mishnah in chapter 3. We've been talking about an eruv, and specifically the food component of the eruv. Our discussion about eruv and about making an eruv that people can carry in on Shabbos, the first 2 chapters were about the mechanics of the eruv, how we surround the enclosure. This third chapter has been about the basket of food that needs to be deposited. This is true for all eruvin, whether we're joining houses in a courtyard or courtyards that abut an alleyway, or a community eruv, or an eruv techumen, where we're going to move our Sabbath boundary because we'd like to walk further in a given direction than would have been possible if we didn't shift our Shabbos dwelling. All these kinds of eruv, which affect our the way we spend Shabbos, what we can carry and how far we can walk, require this deposit of food to be made in a specific place before Shabbos. Now we've been talking about what kind of food is permissible for the eruv and how much is the minimum quantity needed to have a legitimate eruv. And we learned initially that all kinds of food are permissible except water and salt. So now we're still good, but as we saw, as we learned from Rabbi Yochanan, even though the Mishnah said all kinds of food are permitted except water and salt, that doesn't mean that there aren't some exceptions to the rules for various reasons. And as we've seen, if a food is actually harmful, that's going to be problematic. If it's harmful for some people and not others, as was the case with onion leaves and with, what was the food that harms the reproductive system? I think maybe it was clover. I'm sorry, I can't remember right this moment. But at any rate, then it's going to require closer analysis, and it might be allowed and it might not. So we're going to continue to look at some of these foods and ask whether they're permissible, and if so, how much is the minimum amount necessary for a legitimate eruv. So Rav Yehuda teaches in the name of the great sage Shmuel, when we're talking about a relish, the amount is going to be different than if it's a non-relish. So this is very interesting. Now he's dividing the world of food into two categories, relish and non-relish. So relish does not only mean the kind of, chopped up green stuff with some oil that people like to put on a hot dog. It's more generally speaking the category of dips, right? Hot sauce, dip, accompanying food, not the primary food. Often a relish is in its small quantity quite expensive, right? Because it's very tasty, it carries a lot of flavor, it's difficult to make. And so if it's not something that we would make a meal out of, it's a good question, can we make an eruv out of it, right? Because we've already seen that it needs to be something that nourishes us. So does relish nourish a person? Yes, but can you be sustained from it? Not really, but can you make an eruv from it? Yeah, you can. I mean, you could even be sustained from it, right? Like if you were starving and the only thing you had was ketchup, I guess you could eat the ketchup and get a certain number of calories, maybe a lot of calories from it, and you could survive. So the point is, according to the sages, according to here Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that if we have a relish, yes, we can make an eruv out of it, but how much do we need? Is it enough to make 2 full meals out of that relish if that's going to be the only food that's going into this basket to establish the eruv? Answer, no. If it's a relish, all we need is enough relish to accompany 2 meals, the appropriate amount of relish that would accompany 2 meals, even though it does not constitute 2 meals. This really is a chiddush. This is a new piece of information in our understanding of what makes an acceptable eruv. So it's not enough food for 2 meals, but it's the amount of relish that would be necessary to accompany 2 full meals. And as always, when we're talking about meals, we really mean bread, right? So what makes a meal is that it's bread. So if you had enough relish to where your meal was bread and relish, and there was enough relish for a full meal along with the bread, then that's enough for the eruv. Whereas if it's not a relish, right? It's not a relish. It's not the kind of food that's meant to accompany other foods. Okay, then we need enough for the 2 full meals, right? So if you're making it out of bread, which is probably the most standard kind of eruv, so you need enough bread to make 2 meals out of that bread. And that's why matzah is often used, because that way it's going to keep, even if, most likely we're not going to eat the food in the eruv basket, and it'll still be there next week and we can use it again. That's why matzah is typically used. But matzah is bread, right? Matzah is simply bread that hasn't leavened, and that's why we eat it at Passover, because it's unleavened. All right. So non-relish, enough for 2 meals. If it's relish, enough to accompany the food that becomes 2 meals. So now the question is raised, what about raw meat? Can you make an eruv out of raw meat? As we've seen, it needs to be food that's ready to eat. Is raw meat ready to eat? Most of us would probably say no, but the fact is, if you had great need, if you were starving, if you were really, really hungry, you would eat raw meat. And people do eat raw meat, right? There's steak tartare. There's other kinds. Some people have their steak so rare that it's practically uncooked. So raw meat can be eaten as a meal. And if you're going to make an eruv out of raw meat, so then you need 2 full meals worth of raw meat. Everyone agrees on that. The dispute arises when we talk about roasted meat. Here we have a dispute. Rabbah, the great sage Rabbah, says if it's roasted meat, we need enough to accompany 2 meals that are based on bread. So Rabbah is saying that roasted meat is actually like a relish. And when we first hear that's like, oh, wait a minute, roasted meat is not a relish. But when you think about it, very few people eat a meal that is entirely meat. I mean, almost nobody, right? The classic thing we say is meat and potatoes, right? Meat and a starch. A hamburger is meat and bread. So usually we don't make a meal out of the meat itself. Usually the meat accompanies other things, and sometimes even the bulk of the food that we're eating at that meal is not the roasted meat, it's the other foods. So Rabbah says, so it makes sense that in terms of roasted meat, we just need enough to accompany the other foods that constitute these two meals. Rav Yosef disagrees with Rabbah. He says, no. If you're going to make an eruv out of roasted meat, only roasted meat, there needs to be enough roasted meat in there to make 2 full meals out of it. And then he says, and how do I know that? Because the Persians often eat just meat without bread, right? So apparently the Persians, now remember, when we're talking about these sages, Rabbah and Rav Yosef, so they were active in Babylonia. This is Talmud Bavli, right? The Talmud that was established in the Jewish community in Bavel, which is Aramaic for Babylonia. But Babylonia, so that's modern day Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But Babylonia, at the time that the Jewish community was active there and putting together the Talmud, was ruled by the greater empire of Persia, right? So Persia was a very long, dominant empire. I don't know how long exactly they were the dominant empire in the world, but over 1,000 years, I would say. And so that's modern day Iran. Okay, so Abaya tells us, so Rav Yosef says, so the Persians, they do make a whole meal out of roasted meat. Sometimes they eat just meat, no bread, maybe a little relish to go with it, but the main thing that they're eating is the meat. So since those people make a whole meal out of meat, if we're going to have an eruv made only of roasted meat, then since some people eat just roasted meat as a meal, then we should have that at the minimum requirement of that eruv is enough roasted meat for 2 meals. Abaye pops into this dispute and he says, are Persians the majority of the world? No, most people in the world, if they eat roasted meat, it's just part of their dinner. Who can afford to eat just roasted meat as a whole meal? Most people, when they have meat, it's just part of the meal, and the bulk of the meal is actually made of other things like bread, says Abaye. And since Persians who might have that practice to make a whole meal of it do so, we're not going to follow their lead because the majority of the world doesn't do that. And we, when we're establishing minimums for something like this, look at the customary habits of the majority of the world, not just one small group. And he brings an analogy from the law of ritual impurity as it relates to clothing, and specifically cloth. Right? So says Abaye, when there's something that has ritual impurity, tumas, we've often discussed. So ritual impurity, you can contract it by touching a dead body or a creeping thing or people who've had certain bodily secretions, etc. It's ritual impurity. It's not a sickness. It's not cooties. It's not a disease. But when you've touched certain things and you become tameh, ritually impure, so then you can't enter the temple when the temple is standing. You can't enter the temple ground in a state of impurity. It's a big sin. So you have to purify yourself by immersing in a mikveh and doing other things depending on the level of impurity. And then you'll become tahor, pure, ritually pure again, and then you can enter the temple. So the law with respect to clothing can become tameh, can become impure. And the minimum size for a piece of clothing, or let's say a piece of cloth, for it to become tameh is 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths, like a square of cloth, 3 handbreadths wide by 3 handbreadths long. However, there's an exception to that law, to that rule, for poor people. Why? Because for a poor person, a very poor person, a scrap of cloth is significant, even if it's only 3 finger breadths wide, right? So a scrap of cloth that's only 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths is not going to be significant to a rich person or let's say a middle class person, but it might be significant, it might be very significant to a poor person who's saving these scraps of cloth, especially in the ancient world where poverty is like, it's a level of poverty that in the modern world it's hard for us to understand. But if that scrap of cloth is significant to the poor person, so it can actually contract tuma, ritual impurity, even though it would not be significant to the rich person. And so a scrap of cloth that small to the average person or the rich person cannot become ritually impure. For the poor person, it can. So then the question is, well, if it could become ritually impure for the poor person, why didn't we decree that the minimum size to contract ritual impurity, tuma, is the 3 finger breadths measure, the small measure? Maybe that should apply to everybody. And the answer was, that's only for the very, very poor. The majority of people in the world, the minimum size that a cloth is going to be significant is 3 hand breadths, like a foot by a foot, right? A foot by a foot size, like a handkerchief size. And so we didn't decree on the whole world just because it was a smaller group that is affected and has a different law for them. So therefore, why should we do that when we're saying when eruv made out of roasted meat? Just because Persians make a whole meal out of roasted meat, why should everyone who's making an eruv out of roasted meat have to, put 2 whole meals worth of meat into the eruv when it should be enough to say, according to Rabbah, that it's like a relish and it's just enough roasted meat to accompany bread for 2 meals. That's an easier standard for people to meet. Meat is expensive, and the fact is you might eat what's in the eruv basket, but most likely in almost every case you won't eat it. And so that food will go to waste. And we don't want to decree on people that they should put if they're going to have to make it out of meat because that's the only thing that's available, they shouldn't have to put so much meat into the eruv basket. And, says the Gemara, if you say that, well, what's really going on here is that both of these measures are stringencies, right? So when we talk about the minimum cloth size, that's for a stringency, right? We made it smaller. We decreed that it was even smaller, but that's to exact a stringency on poor people so that it's going to affect them, right, in whatever's meaningful to them. And it's a stringency to say that we have to put in 2 whole meals worth of meat. So maybe we're just going to do the ruling that is a stringency in both cases. And the Gemara answers its own question. Yes, but we have the example brought by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says that if an eruv is being made for an old person or a person who's ill and who eats less than the average person, right? He eats less than the average. This is a small group, right? It's a small subgroup of the whole population, just the people who are old or ill and who happen to eat less than others do, right? We've seen as people get older, they eat a little less. If they're ill, they eat less. So what is their definition of 2 meals? It's a lot smaller amount of food than for the average person. And Shimon ben Elazar said, we can make an eruv for an old person or an ill person using that smaller measure of 2 meals that only applies to them. So here we have a situation where we are going to decree that the measure of the eruv is based on this subgroup who has less of a need, and this is a leniency, not a stringency. So since we're establishing a stringency in one case, a leniency in the other, where does that leave us? Are we going to actually decree, according to Rav Yosef, that the minimum measure for meat is 2 whole meals because the Persians have 2 whole meals made of just meat? And the answer is no. The halacha, the law, is going to be like Rabbah. If we're making an eruv out of roasted meat, we only need enough in there to accompany the bread for the meal, that smaller amount. The fact that Persians make whole meals out of roasted meat is not going to overcome the way we would normally assign these minimums, which is how most people handle that situation. And that's how the law is in this case. That was raw meat and roasted meat. Next question, can we make an eruv out of eggs? So Rav Shimi Bar Chia says, Yeah, of course, we could do it with cooked eggs, and we can even do it with raw eggs. Why? Because if a person really needed to, so he could eat raw eggs. We've seen Rocky do it, if you remember the movie Rocky. So then the question is, well, how many eggs need to be in that basket? So the Gemara says that Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak said 1 egg is the minimum, and Sinai said 2 eggs is the minimum. Who is Sinai? This is a nickname for Rav Yosef. And it's a nickname that he holds alongside his sort of learning partner and disputant, who is Rabbah. And Rabbah's nickname is the uprooter of mountains, who uproots mountains, the one who uproots mountains. What does that mean? So often Rav Yosef and Rabbah have disputes, and what they bring to their analysis of Torah and to the tradition is that Rav Yosef knows everything, right? He's just learned the whole tradition. He has everything memorized. He knows not only the law in every situation, but who said what was the majority opinion, what was the minority opinion. He is like Mount Sinai. He carries the whole tradition behind him. He has all of it at the tip of his tongue. Rabbah is the one who uproots mountains. What does that mean? His mind was so sharp. His analysis of the situation, of the question, was so sharp that he could bring a proof that would even uproot a tradition, or at least the way people were understanding something where they thought that's what the tradition said. But Rabbah was able to pierce right through that and say, now, wait a minute, this particular tradition may say such and such, but that's going to contradict principles that we all hold dear, and here's why. And so there have been times when Rabbah was able to overturn a law and bring a new understanding of the law to everyone in his generation. So Rav Yosef is called Sinai, and Rabbah is called the one who uproots mountains. In this case, it's Rav Yosef having an argument with Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak, and the halacha is according to Rav Yosef, to Sinai, that if you're going to make an eruv out of raw eggs, you need 2 eggs. I don't even know why Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak would have thought 1 egg would suffice. Can you make 2 meals out of 1 egg? It just wouldn't make sense. 2 eggs seems so much more logical. But perhaps, an egg is sort of like a relish, and if you just beat it up and used it as a dip for your bread, so maybe you could get 2 meals out of that. Maybe that was his thinking. Bottom line, if you're making an eruv out of raw eggs, you need 2 eggs. Rav Huna teaches in the name of Rav, if a person vows not to taste, not to eat, not even to taste a certain food, like the Nazir vows not to have wine, he also vows not to benefit from wine, and that's the next step. So if a person vows not to eat a certain food, not even to taste it, we may still make an eruv for that person. He can participate in the eruv even though it contains food that he has vowed upon himself not to eat it. Why? Because other people can eat that food. And as we've seen, we can make a Nazir can participate in an eruv that contains wine, and an Israelite, a regular Jew, can participate in an eruv that contains teruma, which is food that can only be eaten by the priest, because at least somebody can eat it, even though he can't. However, if a person vows that he will not benefit from a certain food or even from a certain object, right? So this changes a thing. Right now we're talking about foods because we're talking about making an eruv. If a person has taken a vow that he will not benefit from a particular food, right? Either the food from a certain farm or just that category of food generally, so then if that food is going to be in the eruv, then this person cannot participate in the eruv. He cannot, if he's vowed not to draw benefit, he cannot get the benefit of that eruv. Now, this raises all kinds of questions, because if one is not allowed to participate in an eruv that contains food that he has vowed not to benefit from, so this indicates that, well, then he can't participate in the eruv because he would benefit from the eruv. Now, that makes sense, like when we first hear it, as common sense, right? Because, well, right, you definitely want to benefit from the eruv. Why is the eruv a benefit? Why is the eruv a benefit? So we think to ourselves, well, the eruv is a benefit because, I can carry my baby and I can carry my keys, I can carry my prayer shawl. Or if it's an eruv techumen, I benefit because I can walk further in that direction than I would have otherwise once I shift my Shabbos dwelling. So of course I benefit from it. But our sages teach that an eruv is only established for the purpose of performing a mitzvah. Is carrying my keys or my prayer shawl on Shabbos a mitzvah? No, those aren't mitzvahs. Carrying my prayer shawl maybe is like so that I have it in synagogue, but it's not necessary. There's other prayer shawls in synagogue. Carrying my baby on Shabbos, it's not necessary to perform some other mitzvah, is it? Well, yes. What is the mitzvah that we're doing on Shabbos when we create an eruv? We're fulfilling the mitzvah of enjoying Shabbos, right? We're commanded to delight in Shabbos. And if Shabbos is oppressive on us because of all the things that we cannot do, it's our obligation to figure out how to enjoy Shabbos, right? It's not just that Shabbos ought to be a pleasure because it's a full stop from the world and we put the whole world and the working world behind us, and I don't think about the news and my work and all the stuff of the work week, and it's so calming and soothing to just leave all that behind on Shabbos. It's more than that. It's a commandment to delight in Shabbos, right? Or as Rabbi Y.Y. Rubinstein loves to say is, Shabbos isn't something we have to do. It is, but really Shabbos is something we get to do. It's a privilege, it's a pleasure, and if we're not getting pleasure from it, we got to make arrangements so that we will have great pleasure in Shabbos, obviously while still obeying all of its laws. Within the legal framework of Shabbos, we need to delight in it, and so establishing an eruv is for the purpose of delighting in Shabbos. Okay, so I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of delighting in Shabbos. Is that a benefit to me? No, it's not. And you should say, Sal, what do you mean it's not a benefit? Isn't it a benefit to fulfill your obligations by performing a mitzvah? Of course that's a benefit, isn't it? I mean, it's so good for us. In fact, Pirkei Avos, the wisdom of our sages, teaches that the reward of doing a mitzvah is the opportunity to do another mitzvah, right? Whenever you do a mitzvah, when you do a good deed, when you fulfill your obligation as the law is laid out in the Torah for Jews, we have 613 commandments. Or if you're a non-Jew, you have the 7 laws of the Bnei Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments. So whenever you fulfill your obligation and do one of those mitzvahs, what is your reward? That you get to do another mitzvah. Sounds like a benefit. And if there's so many benefits of doing mitzvahs, right? You come closer to God. You come closer to understanding yourself as a soul in this world. You come closer to doing your mission in this world. You're joined with your community. The mitzvahs that you do on behalf of a community benefit the whole community, and that benefits you because you're a member of the community, and it may even elevate your standing in the community. All these things are benefits. So why would the sages say it's not a benefit to perform a mitzvah? And the answer is very interesting. The answer is because the mitzvahs were commanded on us, right? They were commanded to us. God said, you must do these things. And so the commandments, legally speaking, even though emotionally, of course, they carry tremendous benefit, but legally speaking, the mitzvahs are a yoke around our neck. They're actually a yoke, like a yoke on an ox, right? Like when your oxen are going to pull your plow through the field, you put the yoke around their neck. And that keeps them in line so that they keep walking on the right path. And that's what the mitzvahs are for us. They are a yoke around our neck. Now, it's a yoke put there by God. It's a tremendous kindness of God to tell us what we're supposed to do in this world and to give us all these commandments, which thereby become a mechanism for doing His will. Right? At any time we do God's will, we're going to end up being happier people. I mean, there's no question. There's so many benefits. Nevertheless, legally speaking, the mitzvahs are considered a yoke around our neck. Therefore, a person who vows not to benefit from a certain object may nevertheless use that object for the purpose of performing a mitzvah. Because the mitzvah is not a personal benefit for him. It's him doing fulfilling his obligation. So even though I vow, let's say, for whatever reason, I love fish. I ate too much fish, right? I really got into sushi. I ate too much sushi. I was worried, that there's mercury issues with sushi. I'm not talking about that today. No, I don't want to worry you, but just for whatever reason, let's say I ate too much fish, and I say, you know what? For the next month, no fish for me. I don't want to have any fish. I don't want to look at fish. I don't even want to benefit from fish, right? And so then they tell me that, they put fish in the eruv. So can I benefit from the eruv if there's fish in it? So you would think, according to what I just told you, yeah, I could use the eruv because I'm using the eruv to perform a mitzvah. A mitzvah is not a benefit for me. So even though I vowed not to benefit from fish, I'm just making use of the eruv so that I can perform the mitzvah of delighting in Shabbos, so that I can perform the mitzvah of going to hear a Torah lecture. That's a little bit too far away from my walk outside my normal Sabbath boundary of 2,000 cubits in that direction. But by shifting my dwelling that way, now I can walk far enough to get to that Torah lecture, and I can engage in the mitzvah of Torah learning, of Torah study. But the problem with this logic, and I hope you've been able to follow because it's not so easy, but the problem with this whole logical analysis is if I was only going to benefit from the eruv in that it would allow me to walk where I needed to walk or carry what I needed to carry, then the fact that I vowed not to benefit from a food that's in the eruv basket would not prevent me from making use of the eruv. However, what is an eruv? It's 2 meals. It has to remain accessible, as we've learned, right? You have to be able to get to the eruv in case you need it, because the whole idea is that this eruv basket, wherever I'm depositing it, this becomes my legal and my symbolic and legal dwelling place for Shabbos. Why is it my dwelling place? Because it's my meal if I need it. I may not eat it. I may not use it. I probably won't eat it. I probably won't use it. But it has to be accessible to me. And that's why when we first learned the Mishnah, it told us that we can put the eruv for a priest in a field that had a grave in it that was plowed over and where a priest normally cannot enter, or between graves in a cemetery where a priest cannot enter. Why? Because technically speaking, if he had to, he could still get to that eruv. There's like a process he could go in of blowing the dust around in that field that was plowed over and had a grave in it, and he could make sure that he doesn't come into contact with any pieces of dead body that might have been churned by the plow and spread around the field. Or if he was going to visit the eruv between graves in a cemetery, he could create a system of partitions around the path so that he wouldn't come into contact with any graves. The key is he needs to, if necessary, have access to the eruv. If necessary, if an eruv is made for me, I need to be able to get to it and eat what's in it. But since I have vowed not to take benefit from fish, the fact that there's food available to me, even if I have no plan of eating it, but since it's available to me if I needed it, that is a benefit. And therefore, if I vow not to taste food, I can make use of an eruv that uses that food. But if I vow not to benefit from a food, I cannot use an eruv that includes that food. I'm nearing the end of today's class. If you have questions and comments, please put them in the comments. Okay. We did this. And finally, final teaching. So we just said that it's not considered a benefit to us to fulfill our obligations of performing mitzvahs because mitzvahs are, obligated upon us by God. It's a yoke around our necks. It's a very, very kind yoke that he puts on our necks, but it's still, technically speaking, a yoke, not a benefit. So it's a benefit, right? But we just said that an eruv is a benefit. It's not just that it's established for the benefit of being able to do other mitzvahs, but the eruv itself is a benefit because I could, if I needed to, eat that food. Because it's a benefit for me to have somewhere in my Shabbos, vicinity, a basket of food that I could eat if I needed to. We said that we could put that eruv in a graveyard, right? And a priest could make use of it even though he can't walk on graves. But the bottom line about graves is we can't put an eruv in a cemetery. At least certainly we can't put it on a grave. We can't put it on a grave, right? So we've just shown that it's a benefit to us to have an eruv somewhere because we could eat that food. And if we placed it on a grave, it would mean that we're drawing benefit from the grave. And a person is not permitted to benefit from a grave, right? From somebody else's grave. If it's a plot of land that you bought that you want to be buried in, when you die, I suppose you could benefit from that plot of land. But if it's a grave that contains a dead person, we are not allowed to benefit from it. I tried to do some quick research before the class and get the rationale, why it is that we are not allowed to benefit from a grave in any way. It's interesting because we go to graves of righteous people and ask them to sort of strengthen our prayers to God and to even pray for us to God and to help us, right? People will often pray to God, but at the graveside of famous righteous people, of saints, as it were. But that's not a benefit, and you can't benefit from the grave itself, right? And I guess something to remember is when you're at a grave, right? So this is, I'm not sure what the rationale for this is, but I'm just realizing when you're in a cemetery, when you're at a grave, like let's say you're holding a cup of coffee or like you brought a water bottle with you, don't rest it on the grave because now that becomes a holding place for your property. You're benefiting from the grave and it's disrespectful to the dead. I think the rationale must be that it's disrespectful to the dead to use their grave, for the purposes of the living. That's got to be the rationale. But at any rate, we're not permitted to benefit from a grave, so don't rest your water bottle on a grave when you happen to be in a cemetery. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Let's look at comments and questions, and then we'll see if we can formulate our takeaway from today's class. Lucy Ram Johnson says, it seems that the concept of the Shabbat home, the Shabbat dwelling, also needed to make an eruv, is food. But it has to be food to be shared. You don't even have to be able to eat it, but someone must be able to. So, sharing or potential sharing with another person seems to be at the heart of the concept of home. It's beautiful. Beautiful, Lucy. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny that you said that because I was just writing a piece. I was asked to submit a commentary. There's an organization called 929.org. 929, like our Daf Yomi program where we read the entire Talmud by reading one page a day. It takes 7.5 years to read the Talmud. 929 is a system where you're going to read the entire Bible one chapter a day. I guess there's 929 chapters in the Jewish Bible. So it takes about 3 years to read the entire Bible, one chapter a day. So today I submitted a commentary for a chapter that's coming up soon in that system, and that's Malachi 3. Malachi 3. So the prophet Malachi, it's actually the last chapter of the last book in the prophets section of the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is called Tanakh, which is actually an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The Torah of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then Nevi'im, the prophets, so from Joshua all the way through Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., all the way till Malachi. He's the last prophet who has a book in the Bible. And then the writings, right? So that would include Psalms and Proverbs and other books like that. Okay, so in Malachi, this last chapter, it says that it basically, and this is a quote at the beginning of our movie that Nina and I wrote and I directed, When Do We Eat?, which is about a Passover Seder. But it says just to paraphrase, that God said, behold, days are coming. I'm going to send Elijah to herald the great and awesome day of the Lord, meaning that the Messiah is coming, that the Messianic age is coming. So Elijah is going to come first and announce that the Messiah is coming. And it's the great and awesome day of the Lord when everyone's going to be judged on earth, and we're going to enter that new period of history, the Messianic age. And Malachi says that the prophet Elijah will turn the hearts of the fathers to their sons and the sons to their fathers. Or I, God, will come and strike the land with utter destruction. So it's like, whoa, it seems like there's going to be two paths into the Messianic age. Either God is going to come and create an Armageddon, an apocalypse, right? And out of that ashes, the Messianic age will come. Or there seems to be a much kinder, easier, more peaceful, more elevated, sweet way to bring on the Messianic age. And it seems to involve that families, fathers and sons, sons and fathers, but really families, right? The idea of families are going to turn to each other and be kind to each other. Their hearts will open to each other. And it's like, aren't families already, there's a lot of love within families. Is it the dysfunction of families that is somehow keeping the Messianic age from coming to us? And the answer seems to be, yeah. Because it's in our families that these are the people with whom we spend the most amount of time. And that is the place where most of the world's malfeasance occurs. It's where we're cruel to each other. It's where we're mean. It's where we're ungrateful. It's where we're petty, right? If we could learn to treat our families the way that we would hope a righteous judge would treat the world, right? God can't reward all the righteous or punish all the wicked now in this world at this time, because if God did that, God's presence would not be hidden in this world. It would be overt. And God created this world to be a place where his presence is hidden so that we have free will and we can make choices. But what God is hoping we will do, just like a parent hopes that his child in the playground will treat the other children nicely, as the great sages Bill and Ted of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure would say, be excellent to each other, right? That's what God hopes, that we will be excellent to each other. And it hurts God. It causes God emotional distress to watch us behave so abominably with each other. And he has to, as we learned from Rabbi Haggai on page 22 of Tractate Eruvin, God is long-suffering. God suffers watching us hurt each other, and God suffers watching us be kind to each other and not able to reward us. But the kind of suffering that he has when we're so good to each other and he wishes he could reward us, but he just has to wait until the next world, that's like a sweet suffering for God. And this is a long-winded way of saying to Lucy's point that, Shabbos and the dinner table is all about sharing together, about being together, about taking meals together. And in that context, over the dinner table, that's actually the number one place to practice and exercise kindness. That's where that's where kindness begins, is at the dinner table. And that is why, since the temple was destroyed, we understand that the home has replaced the temple and the dinner table has replaced the altar where we bring our sacrifices. So if at the dinner table we are to sacrifice being right and sacrifice venting our anger and emotions, etc., and instead treat the people around us with kindness, who knows? That might be your act of kindness at the dinner table tonight, might be that last missing mitzvah that's going to take the whole world over the edge into the Messianic age with sweetness rather than apocalypse. Lynn in Texas says, the whole nation of Israel benefited from the 10 eruv tents with food set up to enable the Yom Kippur goat to be escorted out to the wilderness, and no one ate. Or maybe the goat did. So she's bringing down a teaching from Tractate Yoma, or Mishna Yoma 6.4, so we'll get to that when we get to it. that's a different kind of benefit. And as we've established, right? So no rule that says everything is done for a reason. That doesn't mean that there's no exceptions, right? There certainly could be exceptions. But the general principle, Eruvin are created for a benefit so that we can do a mitzvah. But it's not, Eruvin are created so we can do mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are good for us, but they're not considered, legally speaking, a benefit. They're considered an obligation on us. It's just the kindest obligation we ever received because God gave it to us. And finally, Ed Berg, don't we get an emotional benefit from visiting the graves of loved ones? Yes, but I wouldn't call that a benefit because that's attending to the dead, which goes on even after the funeral. It's considered the true kindness, and it's something we do for them. So even though it feels good to do the right thing, anytime we do the right thing, we could call that an emotional benefit. But legally speaking, what we're doing is fulfilling an obligation when we go there. If we rested our water bottle on the grave, that would just be a direct benefit, and that is what's prohibited. And if you think about it, right, we shouldn't do that. It's tacky, right? And likewise, we should be careful not to step on graves, because that actually is a benefit, right? To step on a grave to get to another part of the cemetery, it's like a shortcut. That's just bad in every way. Like, we really need to make our, if we're in a cemetery, don't walk on the graves. And now we know why, because we can't benefit from them. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. I think that was a long-winded way of saying what our takeaway is, so we understand. I'm not going to say it again. So you should have a great, great evening. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow.